Hey, Peaceniks. Today's guest is Michael Rosino. He is the assistant professor of sociology at Molloy College. His new book is Debating the Drug War, Race, Politics, and the Media. From that title, I don't think I should have to say much more. This guy's been really well researched, educated on the drug war. We have a great discussion. I really enjoyed talking with him. I'm glad he reached out and wanted to be on the podcast. Really cool conversation. And before we dive in, just some quick business. If you want to try a hemp cigarette that doesn't taste like shit, that's their slogan. Go to sugarcali.com. Order some Crim hemp cigarettes. They're tobacco free. Great substitute for tobacco. They're actually really delicious. And enter the offer code PEACE15 to get 15% off, and it helps support the podcast. Also, if you use Kratom, if you already know about Kratom, I don't have to explain much. If you don't know about Kratom, it might not be for you. There's a lot of things I'm supposed to not say and things that I can say. And I just feel like I don't want to push a product that someone might not need and then find that they end up with it becomes a habit that they don't necessarily want, didn't necessarily need. I don't want to push something people don't need. So I'm leaving it up to the listener to look into what Kratom is, how it can help you. But mainly for people who already use it, go to happyhippoherbals.com. It's a really cool website. They got a mascot. It's a hippo. It's a happy hippo. All right. So go to happyhippoherbals.com and enter the offer code THEPEACE15 for 15% off your purchase. And they also just sent me this whole big package of different kinds of Kratom. The red vein, yellow vein. They have the green vein mangda, and they also have these really good Kratom taffy that was really awesome. So a bunch of cool little stuff at the store. Check it out, happyhippoherbals.com. Enter the offer code THEPEACE15 to save 15%. So today's guest, once again, with the book Debating the Drug War, Michael Rosino.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
Drugs are menacing our society.
What are your thoughts on the drug problem?
I had a great time doing drugs.
So tonight, from our family to yours, from our home to yours, thank you for joining us.
This is the Peace on Drugs. Well, so thank you so much for doing this podcast. So you are a assistant professor of sociology at Molloy College?
Yeah, that's right.
And that's in New York City?
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's in Rockville Center, which is on Long Island, but I commute from Brooklyn, so yeah, I live in the city. Mm-hmm.
Very cool. Yeah, and thank you for sending me the book. I got a copy, the digital copy, and I've read some of it. I ordered your book. It'll be here Friday, so I'm excited to read that. Actually, yeah. I love that you're doing that kind of work. It's so important, and I have another book that I can reference because, it's always the same books. My listeners are here. It's either Johann Hari or The New Jim Crow. And there's like two others. And then, so it's great to have more stuff to reference.
I appreciate that. Yeah. Anything you can do to get the word out. I'm always honored to be mentioned in the same breath as people like that. So yeah, no, that's an honor. And I think a lot of people feel the same way, like way too much screen time. So, I'm the same way. I need a physical book too, so I totally get that.
Yeah, but I just got it last week, so I read through the introduction and got into the first chapters, and I already find it really interesting. Like, for one thing, I love that when I read these kind of books that I constantly am reading the same subject matter now that I do this podcast. But no matter what, every book I'm learning new stuff. And you brought up that because we all know, or those of us that know about the drug war understand that racism really is at the heart of most of these things. And I didn't realize that alcohol prohibition, there was racism behind that, and it was against the Jews. So I learned something new there.
Yeah, no, it's been interesting for me because I think, I started off in the similar kind of place of curiosity as a lot of people. I grew up in a situation where, like many young people, I experimented with recreational drug use. And I've always been curious and fascinated, kind of, I think a lot of people have this basic sense if they're peripherally involved in drug subcultures, or maybe even just, have been engaged with the politics of it. It's like, it's very clear that the policies don't correspond with evidence, they don't correspond with reality. And I think until I really started doing this research, I didn't know, I guess, how far down the rabbit hole I could go with kind of just how much, racism, racial oppression, social control of certain groups has been kind of, I guess I would call it like the animating logic of all of this. I mean, I remember being a teenager and being like, the basic sitting through, commercials on TV or whatever and being like, okay, clearly cannabis isn't that harmful compared to alcohol. I've seen people have completely like horrible times blacking out, and I've never seen anything compared to that with a lot of other substances. Clearly, there's some hypocrisy there. It doesn't really make sense. But it really took me getting this project together, getting my background in sociology to really put all the pieces together. So it's been a really eye-opening experience for me as well, even just kind of doing this work. And a lot of the things that people tell me they're surprised or learned for the first time, I will have the complete humility of saying I also learned a lot of this stuff for the first time as I was writing the book. So I'm glad that's coming across.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that. I started this podcast thinking I understood the drug war. I understood that it needed to end. I understood drug culture because I've been a part of it pretty much since I was a teenager. Started smoking cannabis and then went to psychedelics. But once I started this podcast and started researching, there was so much I didn't understand. And one of the things that really opened my eyes was the fact that I thought I'd been really badly abused by the system because I'd been arrested for cannabis. I've been denied employment. But compared to what happens to a lot of minorities, I've had it really easy. And I just didn't see that because I didn't, a lot of it's just kind of pushed under the rug. We don't see it.
Absolutely. And I'll be interested, I don't know if we, maybe we can chat again once you've read the book. I'll be interested to hear more what you think about this. But yeah, I think there's a lot of evidence that there are almost like two different tiers or two different tracks that people can kind of be put along. Both of them are fairly punitive, but all of the disparities that take place kind of, they kick in at almost every step in the process. So one thing that I found when I was doing my research for this book was I was able to find evidence for racial discrimination taking place at every single step of the legal system process. So, it's obviously, on principle, I think a lot of people would agree that taking a punitive approach to substance use across the board is dysfunctional and harmful. And I think there's a lot of people that definitely have that sense based on their personal experience or their research and thinking about these things. But what's so interesting is that at every single step, from arrests, getting charged, sentencing, pretrial diversion, whether or not you qualify for a treatment program versus, other types of things, whether or not you're held, whether or not you receive bond and you can bail out. At every single step, there's research from sociologists and criminologists that's now demonstrating that your racial category, whether or not, particularly if you're Black or Latinx, it is a major factor that predicts how harsh the system is coming down on you. Even if we control for what the type of offense is, even if we control for your income level, so it's not even purely a social class thing. Yeah, so I think, I'm glad to hear that more people are becoming aware of that, because I've noticed that it does seem like even policy reform organizations are now taking that more seriously. When previously, I think a lot of the very well-intentioned drug reform advocates tended to take kind of a colorblind approach and maybe even avoid talking about the racial disparities or wanting to acknowledge them. So, yeah, I think it's a good time to kind of be having this conversation as well, given that.
Yeah, definitely. And I just wanted, the punitive approach thing has just never worked. And, they did it with crack. They made crack, 100 times worse than cocaine, and then of course Obama, the Fair Sentencing Act, reduced it to 18-1, which is why not just 1-1, or why not stop arresting people for it to begin with and start treating people. But now you see the same thing happen with fentanyl. They're going to pass legislation to start heavily criminalizing fentanyl over other opiates, and they're just missing the point of what's going on. They're not seeing the solution, and the solution is right in front of all of us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that happens is the war on drugs represents a moral panic. It represents certain people in society wanting to demonize a certain other group of people. And in order to do so, you end up creating these institutions and these power structures that really take a deep-seated interest in maintaining these systems. So that's one of the reasons why it's so hard to achieve fundamental reforms, is that, you know, to be blunt about it, there are very wealthy and powerful people who are concerned that their flow of influence over the public, their ability to use the prison population for labor, their ability to, let's say for police departments and DA's offices, their ability to get a huge budget that they use for engaging in these actions. I think they see those as, they see drug reform and even a sort of human rights centered, humanistic sort of approach as being fundamentally at odds with their interests. And that's one of the things that I really have had to grapple with as I've thought more about this topic. And I'm sure it's something you've grappled with as well, is that, yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't actually just come down to the evidence. It doesn't just come down to the more, you know, which side is more reasonable or what even might work to help people or solve the problems. It comes down to politics, and it comes down to conflicts and conflicts of interest and power and all this other way more messy stuff that, you know, I think a lot of us would like to shy away from, but I think we're increasingly recognizing that that's actually how change happens. So yeah, no, I definitely appreciate what you're saying on that end.
But no, you are right though. The reason that we're not moving in the right direction isn't only because they don't understand the problem. It's these big groups. I mean, you have the DEA, which is this huge militarized police force that if they solve the drug problem, they don't exist anymore. So they have no interest in actually doing their job the correct way.
Yes, absolutely. And even further to your point about you know, evidence and you know, kind of, I think there's a conversation that's had a lot of times among drug policy reform advocates, which is like, you know, we all like to say, hey, we know this, we know the truth, because a lot of us have done our own evidence, a lot of us have personal experiences, and there is a long history of the federal government overtly ignoring reports and research and evidence on effective drug control strategies, on the psychological, biochemical, and sociological impacts of different drug use, even going back to you know, the LaGuardia report, which I believe was in the 1930s. That was set up by the mayor of New York at the time. And it was a panel of doctors and social scientists. And this was in the 1930s. And they advocated in the report that cannabis should be legalized, that it should be treated, you know, as a sort of, as like, if people need treatment or they do have issues, that they should be able to receive treatment. They debunked these myths that we still live with today, and that a lot of these organizations get their power from, like the idea of the gateway drug myth. Mm-hmm. They were debunking that in the 1930s. So even, you know, before we think of the history of the war on drugs as being sort of like, you know, Ronald Reagan steps in the 80s and really sets up this military strategy, the basis for ignoring inconvenient information so that certain powerful actors could push these strategies has been going on for an extremely long time. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so powerful. And that's one of the reasons why I think debunking these myths as much as possible is a really powerful tool.
I
Absolutely.
agree. And every time that the government's, they've put funding into research, the research was always pointed. It was saying, we want you to find something negative about cannabis, whatever you can come up with. And all the research would come back and say, what we found was positive things. And they would immediately get defunded and be like, nope, we're going to find somebody else to do this research, which immediately says the government has no interest in actually solving what they consider a problem. Their problem is, how do we control people? How do we get
Exactly.
more money for whatever we're doing? And the private prison system, I mean, that concept in general is absolutely insane. And, and I'm not anti-capitalist, but this is capitalism gone amok, when you have people investing in prisons and then needing and lobbying for laws to create that are going to put more people in prison. And how do you get most people in prison? Cannabis was the best answer, because people use it and they want to.
Exactly. I absolutely. And just, to your point about the type of research that's been done to bolster these myths about drug use, I came across some research that was actually funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, which did a lot of grants about the adverse effects of cannabis. And one of the things that kind of blew me away is it was a study that was ostensibly about how cannabis impacts like motor skills and people's response timing and stuff, basically implying that, it is extremely intoxicating and maybe that driving while high might be an issue. But what they actually did was they had people consume cannabis in a controlled environment and had them do a flight simulator. And I was like, I'm pretty sure we can all agree that maybe you shouldn't be like smoking a joint before you go like fly an airplane. I don't think that's wild to say, but like, then presenting it in a way that says, okay, we've proven that, it has all these adverse effects on hand-eye coordination. It impacts response time. And therefore it is this debilitating, dangerous substance. It gets very distorted. And, even the memory, even sort of the barring of studying hallucinogens, I think is a major issue as well with that. There are so many benefits and medicinal applications of these substances that are not allowed to be studied. And when they are, it's in very controlled environments. And a lot of times it's in a way that is meant to give the pharmaceutical industry a lot more control over these substances in a way that kind of removes it from the cultures that they emerge from. So definitely. Yeah, I think there's a lot of connections there.
There definitely is. And if you look at like the peyote ceremonies and the way that the natives use these, the sacramental plant medicines, whatever you want to call them, they don't use them recreationally the way we do. They do them as a rite of passage. They have certain ceremonies. And I think that, our culture, LSD could be, for white culture or whatever you want to call it, I think LSD is our sacrament. And it's not been allowed to use in any of these research. They've pretty much gotten LSD out of the picture. So that's why psilocybin's the only one becoming legal. And I think psilocybin's amazing. But you're right. They're trying to package this whole microdose thing. How can we make money off this? The idea that somebody can take psilocybin, have an amazing experience, and then not need medicine for 6 months, maybe never again. But if you every few months to do a ceremony, that doesn't make any money for those pharmaceutical companies, so they have no interest in doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so much research demonstrating that periodic and sporadic experiences, nonlinear experiences, or experiences that allow people to kind of have those expansive moments can be incredibly beneficial for people's perspective, for their sense of self. We also know that there's obviously huge downsides to people doing those things in the wrong setting or with the wrong motivations. It's an extremely sort of powerful tool, but I agree with you. I think when you have that profit motive involved, it really distorts what could otherwise be a very humanitarian good. I think in partial, what we're seeing is this reflects a wider dynamic that we see just in the medical industry and healthcare in general, where the United States does have a lot of perverse incentives with insurance and pharmaceutical companies, hospital management, many of the decisions that are, on paper about providing health for people or helping people get healthy, really do have this motive to monetize it and privatize and profit. That I think, when it comes to something like someone's health, the way that I think about it as a sociologist is, that's, there are certain places where you can have markets because demand is going to ebb and flow. But when it comes to someone's mental or physical health, people will be willing to pay whatever they can in order to feel okay, in order to get to the other side of that. So it puts consumers at an extreme power disadvantaged if you say, hey, we're going to raise the price of this drug, or hey, we're going to make it really difficult for you to access this treatment that could be really effective, simply because we want to see how much you'll pay for it. We want to know how much we can squeeze out of it.
Yeah.
And I think that is like sort of a generalizable principle that we can see both in the war on drugs and in how it mirrors other industries, which are on one hand claiming to be about protecting health and protecting safety, but on the other hand, introduce a lot of power and influence and sort of this profit motive and how that can really distort things.
Yeah. And one thing you said actually kind of leads me to this question I have about heroin. It's a different subject on drugs, but the idea that people will pay whatever they can to make themselves feel better. And this also, so when you have heroin goes to the streets, the price that people pay, it's not even just the cost of the drugs that are 1,000% more on the streets, but the chance of the risk of death, the loss of limbs for injecting different chemicals. I mean, the price is so high, but people are still paying it because people are going through trauma or whatever they're trying to escape, and heroin seems to help them. And I was curious, I was going to ask you what your thought is on heroin, because that's a taboo one. A lot of people are on different sides of the fence, but what do you think about the heroin laws? Should people have legal access to a drug like heroin?
I think that is a really interesting question, because I think you're right that is where a lot of people are much more polarized. I think we do have sort of a cannabis exceptionalism sort of problem in the drug reform world, where I think that feels like the safe topic to talk about reform, to talk about, humanizing cannabis users. I think there are substances like heroin or anything that almost gets labeled as a hard drug that, it becomes a third rail. People become afraid to humanize the people that use it. And they also are it's also a place where I think even people who are experts and even people who are interested in reforming policies sometimes fall victim to myths. So I think that personally, based on my research into this topic, I think that I am very in favor of a complete across the board harm reduction / pleasure maximization approach to all drug use. I think that the number one harm proposed by substance use is the fact that people are doing it in incredibly dangerous circumstances, and that they're doing it under the fear of incarceration. I don't think that there are any forms of substance use that is going to contribute to a healthier environment. And I think that if people can get past their sort of the dehumanization and the moralization of drug use that has really been basically, we've been socialized into through the media depictions of drug use, through PSAs, through even things like DARE programs that aren't effective, through the narratives that we see in the media where, let's say the New York Times does a story on the opioid epidemic, and who they decide to interview is like police officers and, other people who have a vested interest in criminalization. I think if we can get past that and actually see that these are human beings, many people who use heroin actually don't have a substance use disorder, which I think is the first myth and misconception that most people struggle with. So most of the research indicates that people who use heroin don't do so in a disordered way. It doesn't actually disrupt their life. It's fairly sporadic. It's not what we would consider disordered use. And that there are other predictors for disordered use that we could actually control for and try to get at the root cause of if we as a society are genuinely concerned with substance use disorder. As you mentioned, it's much more linked to trauma. It's linked to people having issues with social disconnection, people self-medicating because they're dealing with extreme financial or psychological strain. And these are all things that neither incarceration nor forcing someone to go through an illicit market is going to ever resolve.
No,
and so I think, that's my take on it. I think that, I might have a little bit more of a radical perspective than even maybe most people in my field. And I think it's because I'm deeply interested in thinking of these problems in terms of what is the real human experience that's being produced by this? How is it producing suffering? How is it producing joy for real living, breathing people that could very well be me? It's only through happenstance that I didn't go down that path. It's not because I'm like some great moral person. It just didn't happen to me. So yeah, I think that's genuinely how I look at it. There's so much evidence that if the metrics we're using are reducing substance use disorder, reducing harmful substance and dangerous substance use, making sure that people aren't using toxic and poison drug supplies out of desperation. Like all of those things have real human costs that are like life and death for our friends and neighbors and family members. So that tends to be how I look at it. I think that if there were supervised consumption sites, if there were access to a safe and controlled supply, I think that if there was much more access to treatment that wasn't zero tolerance, for instance, I think that if there was a lot more opportunities for housing and employment that weren't precarious based on drug testing, I think all of those things would actually contribute to resolving the opioid crisis or the overdose crisis way more than any of the things we're doing now.
100%. And, I'm sure you're familiar with the rat studies, the rat palace. And so like they said, we've created the first version of that where we have people like if we wanted to make a society that's going to lead people to addiction, we've done exactly that. People that have trauma and that use drugs, then we arrest them. And, because I've used heroin. When I was younger, I recreationally smoked heroin. I never got addicted to it. Had I been arrested and had I been, because every time I was arrested for like cannabis, which happened twice, it added stress to my life, financial stress. I fought with my wife and those kind of things as I was growing spiritually and finding who I was. And, I was, trying to overcome some trauma in my past. I was able to get out of all that. And I'm not addicted to any drugs now, but it could have been a lot worse. And if I'd been arrested and spent time in prison, it only would have been worse. And that's what we're doing to these people. And it's really sad. And I think that's what your goal is. And my goal is we're trying to make a healthier society and help these people. And I think another thing is about the way the reason heroin is so taboo is that when you look at heroin through the lens of the drug war, which is the only way we've seen it. Nobody alive today ever remembers a time when it was legal. And so all they know is so in their minds, if you legalize it, the problems we see now will only be worse. They can't see it going the other way because it doesn't really make sense if you don't really think too much about it. So.
No, I agree with you. And I think the question that I think, a lot of people need to consider, especially if they don't have a lot of personal experience with heroin, is it's almost like the assumption is that the only reason the average person isn't like shooting up heroin right now is because it's illegal. And it's like, I think that it's people's motivations for using substances. You have to give people a lot more credit than that that's not how it works.
Right.
And especially for the average person who's maybe abstinent from drugs or has never used substances, it's like, well, think about it from your perspective. Is that what's preventing you from doing it? Or is it that just doesn't appeal to you, or, you're not interested in altering your consciousness or whatever? Because that's not what really makes the difference. Yeah. So even that, even sort of the idea of like it deterring people by being illegal, there's really not a lot to back that up.
No, there's not.
Yeah, and I think, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I had Dr. Junkie on my podcast, and he said that he asked everybody the same thing when he says, if heroin was legal, everybody do it. He's like, would you? And they always say, well, I wouldn't. It's like, well, exactly. So like that's you just proved my point,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that people are very willing to apply one set of reasoning to themselves and their families and their neighbors. But I think that there is sort of this mythical folk demon out there that people have in their minds of the criminal. I would call it the drug criminal. I think that it's something that is pretty deeply racialized in many cases. Mm-hmm. So when you look at like the 1980s, the way that the quote unquote drug problem or the crack epidemic was depicted, it was depicted as being present in sort of crumbling public housing and like urban decay in predominantly Black communities. But at the same time, rates of powder cocaine use among white suburban young adults was skyrocketing and causing just as many, if not different types of problems. And so I think that one of the issues is this thing that has been very successful for the drug warriors of our society is that if they can associate drug use with an already disadvantaged or stigmatized group, it becomes that much easier to dehumanize anyone who is remotely either empathetic towards or who uses any kind of substance. Because I think it creates such an empathy gap where it becomes very difficult for people who are having these conversations to remember that they're talking about human beings and that they're talking about human beings with, all the same rights, responsibilities, joys, privileges, interests as anybody else. So I think, I'm really I'm excited about the work that's being done at the grassroots level to just try to think of people with substance use disorders and people who just use substances recreationally or medically that are banned, to really think of them as people that have rights and that their rights don't end. Their human rights, their civil rights don't end simply because they ingested a certain substance.
And also, and people that used heroin before it was outlawed and people that use heroin in places like Switzerland, they're very high functioning, regular people, just like someone who has a drink of alcohol every night after work. It's the same kind of thing. You don't think of those people as alcoholics just because they have a beer every day or 2 or 3 beers every day, but that's
absolutely.
So, and the thing is, heroin, if you're searching for it on the streets, it's extremely expensive, which leads to a life of crime. A lot of the drug dealing itself happens because of addicts needing money for their own drugs. So the prohibition has caused what we view as the drug problem. And if you ever watch Intervention, I know it's a horrible show, but do you watch it to see what? Go ahead.
I've never actually watched that show. I think you're right that I would probably not like it because of the narrative device that they use. But I'm curious what your take is on it.
Well, so I wanted to watch it to get a perspective of what the average person views addiction as, and I'd never seen the show, so I turned it on, and it was so awful. I only watched one episode. It's all I could stomach. And this girl, she was a meth addict, and she was freaking out, and her parent fighting with her mom, and they were dragging her out of the house. The cops came and they put her in handcuffs, and they put her in the back of the car. And so you see somebody at their worst on camera in front of their family. And then the doctor on the show looks at the camera and says, she's in a really bad place. She is very sick. Jail is going to be a good thing for her. And that just really just pissed me off. I was like, have you ever heard of a hospital? You're a doctor. Like,
yeah, that's like, hey, we're going to send you to jail because you have cancer.
Yeah.
Like that's the reasoning. I think, I think this is what when you see where there are these industries that are deeply invested in this approach. Certainly the media plays a big part of it. And that's why in my book, I wanted to build on the work of previous people who've analyzed the history of the drug war and analyzed, the legal ramifications and analyzed, the inequalities. But like one thing I thought was missing was we know that the media is also perpetuating a lot of the worst myths and stereotypes and about drug use and about who uses drugs, why they use drugs, what the solution is. And so I think that's why, the media has become, at least in my perspective, I think the media is an important battleground for more people who are, more empathetic to humanizing drug users and people who are caught up in the system. And also people who are coming from a place of having actually done the real empirical research on these topics. Like, more of those people need to be part of the conversation that appears in media. I really have been pushing when I meet with policy organizations or activists, like write that op-ed, make a documentary, make a piece of media that presents your side. Try to connect with journalists, try to connect with people and try to be, a voice that's in the conversation, because public opinion is really being shaped by mass media as much as anything else. And I think that's such a powerful force where you can see change happening, because this is something that I know just as a sociologist who studies media. When people don't have direct experience with something, like let's say someone has never been involved in the legal system, someone has never used substances, all they've ever done is kind of just heard about all this stuff secondhand. The media is actually going to be their primary source of information on these topics. People like yourself or me who have either direct experiences or, we've done research. Obviously, you've had so many conversations, I'm sure, with this podcast that have opened your eyes, that you don't need to rely on media depictions in the same way that someone else might. But I think that really points to the fact that media is such an important institution for changing the tide on these policies and for changing people's perspectives on it.
I'd say it's the number one thing that people get their ideas from. Their opinions are mainly formed through the television they watch, and and it even happens in shows like growing up watching like Saved by the Bell or Family Matters. There's going to be they're going to have the episode where one of their friends goes down the wrong path and ends up on drugs, and then the hero comes and gets them out of that situation, and then you learn as a child, you're like, oh, drugs are bad. The good person doesn't do them. And also the person that slipped up and did drugs, usually there was some villainous person that seduced them into doing the drugs. It was just some crazy thing. So, and I remember watching this one show. It was I want to say it was from the 70s. I don't remember it, but a detective comes in and they base the character on Timothy Leary. So he's in there, he's all trippy, it's all the psychedelic stuff all around him, and the cops are like there to arrest him. He's like, I don't have anything on me, you can't arrest me. And he's like, we had a kid pull out his own eyes so he could stare at himself. What would you say to that? And then, but the way they presented it was the Timothy Leary character had a really good argument for everything they were saying, but ultimately the cops won. And this made it look like they were giving a fair thing. But what they didn't say was what he should have said is nobody's ever pulled their own eyes out to look at themselves. Yeah. But what his actual response was, well, what he saw on LSD was more real than anything he'll ever see in life. And it's like, no, that's not
a good argument.
No. And it's not, nobody's ever done that, but that's the kind of things that people heard, and they've heard the stories. Someone stared at the sun until they went blind. People thought they could fly and jumped off buildings. And while there are stories, there's, one in a million of something like that does happen. Tragedies happen, alcohol every day, but we perpetuate it by making it sound like that story is what's going to happen to anybody who touches it. And like you said, people who don't have any direct experience with it, that's all they know are these stories. So they're terrified of these drugs.
Absolutely. Yeah, the stories we tell and who gets to be the protagonist and who we empathize with plays a huge role. So if we're encouraged to empathize with the good guys, and I think of the one that you pointed out with like Saved by the Bell or like these media tropes, like they really do have a profound impact. So I think there is definitely a sense that, I got this even in my research, because in my research, I looked at basically how people respond to different arguments about drug policy, not only in media, like newspapers and op-eds and journalism, but also in like the comment sections of articles. Like, if let's say I look at an article where they're presenting a certain argument, I wanted to go to the comment section and analyze, what are the things that, what are the frames, what are the big ideas they're relying on to make sense of these arguments? And definitely people draw a distinction between the drug user, who's basically like a dupe, they're like manipulated or tricked, the drug pusher or the drug dealer, who is like a very malicious, evil person who oftentimes is almost just depicted as like a straight up monster who just needs to like go to jail, and they're evil. But you also have to think about like the way that these problems are depicted in terms of different social groups. So usually what you see in the media is that drug dealers tend to be depicted as people of color. They tend to be depicted as Black or Latinx people, when the research just doesn't bear that out at all. Most of the research demonstrates that white people are actually more likely to sell drugs, not only just because of the demographics, but because the only information that we really usually go off of for this stuff is arrest data. And the arrest data is based on what communities are being targeted for drug use, or what for enforcement of these laws. When research actually tries to demonstrate actual rates of drug dealing, which is difficult to do, but the research that has taken place on that has demonstrated that there's not actually this overwhelming disparity where people of color are drug dealers. We also see that, the so-called victims of the war on drugs tend to be depicted as, or the victims of the drug problem tend to be depicted as young white people who have a lot of promise, potentially, plans of a career, going to college. Maybe they come from a middle-class background and they just made a mistake and they slipped up, and, they deserve redemption. And this is actually a narrative that was unfortunately pushed by a lot of drug reform organizations in the 80s and 90s, of depicting people who use cannabis or other drugs as sort of these, hey, these are veterans, these are young white college students, these are good, upstanding, middle-class kids who just, they either went down the wrong path or they're having a hard time. But it still left open this whole frame of there being this sort of evil drug dealer character that is still deserving of, in this narrative, of violence, of control, of extreme levels of surveillance, of not having any human rights. And so it still left open the possibility that there could still be these two different classes of treatment. And it still perpetuated the narrative that if we associate certain drug use with whiteness and middle-class lifestyles, that'll at least destigmatize it for the people in those communities. And at a certain point, I do worry about, I think that there has been a real tone shift over the past couple of years, which I've been really excited to see, especially places like here in New York, where organizations, grassroots organizations, are really taking these inequalities seriously. But I do think that there has been a little bit of a legacy of policy reform organizations that were mostly concerned with making sure that people who already had access to privilege and privacy could use cannabis without being inconvenienced, rather than looking at the big picture of resolving mass incarceration or police brutality or the targeting of certain communities. So yeah, we can see that in the media as well, though, that it's carving out these very specific, like it's like the stories we tell and who the characters are has such a huge impact on how people interpret reality. So I think you're spot on with that.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you what the general consensus is in the universities, because you're an associate professor, so you're in that world of the universities. And I remember reading, my buddy that was in UNC Asheville sent me the book Going Up the River. It's about the prison. It says travels in a prison nation. So I feel like the universities have always been a little bit ahead of the curve because they're studying this stuff. So they're seeing the problems of mass incarceration. But with drug legalization in the universities, what is their general opinion around professors in that place?
It's interesting because I think that there are people who are strongly dependent on the grant system. So their research could be very easily framed by the type of funding that they're receiving from the National Institute for Drug Addiction, or the National Institute on Drug Addiction, which is going to frame things in terms of, hey, let's make sure we're focusing on, we want you to do a study where you're demonstrating the potential, the potential risks of a certain policy reform. So I think that does create a little bit of a difficult situation. But I think what I'm seeing in terms of people who study drug use, drug addiction, and drug policy that aren't so closely aligned with those sort of traditional institutions and power structures is that they are taking there is much more interest in a few different areas. One is harm reduction. So there has been a huge growth in empirical research and study on harm reduction. It's being taken up in a lot of different fields, from public health to sociology to other areas. I also think that there are a lot of legal scholars that have been doing a lot of really good work on just fighting the legal arguments around these cases. So like Michelle Alexander is such a great example of that, but I almost think of her as sort of like the tip of the iceberg. She's kind of the public face of that work that's been going on for years, from legal scholars and activists who have just been compiling the evidence and compiling the arguments to really make the case for these more crucial structural reforms, for things like, reparations for victims of the drug war, for having an equity strategy when we do finally pass some drug reforms. So like, for instance, here in New York, when they legalized cannabis, and by the way, happy holidays.
Yeah, that's right.
We're recording this.
420.
Cheers for that. But but when they legalized cannabis, it was majorly pushed by researchers and people who were very active in public health, people that were very active in activism and ground, in a really big collaboration between academics and grassroots activists and people who were interested in policymaking. And because of that, they were actually able to pass some of, at least in my opinion, some of the best and most expansive and liberating drug policies in the country. So, one major thing that they did that I think is so impressive, and that is based on a lot of the research that's been done on the war on drugs, is they actually set it up so that all of the money that is going to come in through the cannabis industry, we're talking probably billions of dollars in tax revenue for, all of those cannabis transactions. They set it up so that it would actually be invested in the communities who were most harmed by the war on drugs. So like a mechanism like that can make a huge difference. And So it's been excellent for me. I don't know what the mainstream consensus is among academics, but at least in the corner of the academic world that I'm most active in, and the people that I most frequently talk to and collaborate with, there is a huge push right now for recognizing that reforms are really not going to be meaningful or possible unless they address these underlying structural issues, inequalities. And so I think more and more people are taking that seriously. More and more people are taking seriously the idea of harm reduction, abolition, liberation, and human rights as kind of being the forward-thinking principles for our policies. I think it's taking up traction in certain places. I think one thing that's been disheartening, and I'm sure a lot of people feel this way, is just the federal space is very unresponsive to the public consensus. So even outside of experts, the average person, thinks cannabis should be legalized.
Yeah, right. So 2/3 of Americans want it legal. So if our representatives really, were working for us, they would have decriminalized it, a while ago.
Well, that's what the Biden-Harris administration has even promised to do in order to secure the Democratic nomination. Is that they put that on their agenda. Mm-hmm. I'm tend to be pretty cynical when it comes to powerful people, because I study politics and I study power. So I guess I'm less interested in like sussing out, if someone's a good person or not or whatever, but I'm more interested in what I think they're likely to do. And I think that a lot of people forget how deeply entwined this current federal administration is with the war on drugs, that mm-hmm. Joe Biden is the architect of the crime bill. He's mm-hmm. responsible for creating mass incarceration. Kamala Harris, as the district attorney of California, was a pretty harsh enforcer of drug laws, even in a time when drug laws were liberalizing in California. She kind of pushed back against that. So yeah, I think one of the things that I really try to think about is like, there's so much action taking place at the state level that's really exciting and really great to focus on. And that's really, I think, where I see the most cool stuff happening, especially with activists and researchers being able to actually speak to policymakers. But I think what it's going to take is figuring out how to hold elected leaders at the federal level accountable, because as it stands, a lot of people feel like holding the Democrats accountable, the only thing they can come up with is voting for Republicans, who are probably going to just have more regressive drug laws. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of that I think puts a lot of people in a double bind in terms of the federal level. And I think that's one of the limitations that we're facing right now.
Yeah, it's really messed up. And I did on the vice presidential debates, Kamala Harris said that they were going to decriminalize cannabis and expunge records, and that's the last you heard about it. And mm-hmm. and it really is bothersome. And I'm curious to see what happens with this MORE Act thing, but it's just surprising. You see the Republicans, only 3 Republicans voted for the MORE Act. It's like, what do they have against this? If their constituents want it, it's the numbers are in that we want cannabis legal. So why are the Republicans so against it? And then, like you said, the Democrats might talk about doing it, but when they get in power, they're not doing it. And there was 20 candidates on that stage for the Democratic primary, and the only one that never said anything about legalization, he's the one that got the nomination.
Yeah, it's difficult, and I think when you ask, I think you raised a really interesting point, because I'm so deeply interested in the actual, and that's why in my book I really center on what I call like the racial politics of this. But I think just in a general sense, the politics of it, because one question that I think is very illuminating to why this is such a struggle and such an uphill battle despite there being a public consensus on this issue, is I think that many politicians of both parties have a much different sense of who their constituents are than what you and I, as the average person, think it should be. I'm not sure that they regard the average person who lives in their state or their district as the constituents. I think their constituents in their minds are, who are the people that are going to help me raise funds for my reelection campaign? Who are the consistent lobbies that I need to appease? Who are the policy-making organizations that are going to put legislation in front of me that I can sign? And when you think about it through that lens, the constituents are much more likely to be police departments, different industries that make a lot of money off of substances being criminalized, organizations that have taken a really strong moral stance on these issues. And I think, we're getting at, I think, maybe a larger issue of this is just one further symptom. The disconnect between public opinion and policy on drug policy, it represents a larger symptom, or it's one symptom of a larger problem of just the lack of democracy. That I think, it is bigger, but I hope that more people that are concerned with the drug policy side of it take seriously that, one of the things that's going to really hinder the success of the drug reform movement is the lack of political equality and political rights, because you could get everyone on board who's just a regular person. You could win the the marketplace of ideas, as they say. And unfortunately, that might not be enough until there's also sort of more power in the hands of people and more accountability. So I think that's kind of the next thing to try to think about, is how to hold elected officials accountable in a real way to what they say they're going to do, or at least what most people want. I think that's kind of the bigger question. I don't have the answer, obviously, but I think that's the bigger issue.
Getting money out of our politics is going to be, it's not possible, unfortunately, but that's what we need to happen. They shouldn't be able to just blindly give. And also, these pharmaceutical companies, they don't just put money in one candidate's pocket. They put them in both pockets. So whoever wins, they're in our pocket. It doesn't matter which one wins. And so that's why you see a lot of the bills that pass are very similar to the Republicans. They differ. The things they differ on are things like more social issues, like we got Democrats got gay marriage legal. The Republicans are fighting abortion issues right now. But the issues, the economic issues and stuff like that, and crime issues, they tend to be the same. Like you see, Clinton was worse than his predecessor with what he did for crime, and he reducing housing costs and upping the prison budget, and you wouldn't think a Democrat should do that we should be going the other way, but that's not how it's been working. They just are all moving in the same direction.
Yeah, it's something that I talk to students about, because I think that when I'm talking to my students about politics, they're very concerned about polarization, and I think that's something that they really see that maybe makes them stressed out, or that's where they see politics as a space that's very contentious and scary. They see the fact that people in their families with different political identities can't get along, or people are yelling at each other, and so they're very worried about polarization, and I think rightfully so. But one of the things that I've encouraged them to kind of also think about is, one of the problems is also that if we have these two giant parties, there are going to be things that they agree on that the average person might not agree on, that could be just as damaging, in the fact that we don't have any opportunities to influence that. Then, if there are areas where both parties agree, then maybe we're only then our only options are basically I don't know, whichever one seems like the lesser of two evils, whichever one is going to be maybe not be so bad on it. And it's it does make sense. I think sometimes when people start to go a little nihilistic, especially about electoral presidential politics when it comes to this stuff.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And it just gets to a point where you just question whether even going to vote. I mean, I've voted third party for most of my elections. There's been a few that I decided to go with the major party because I thought it was important. But like last year, I actually changed my I registered from independent to Democrat so that I could vote in the primary because it was very important to me. But by the time the primary got to my state, Biden it was already him. So it didn't make any difference. I didn't get a vote or a say in the primary. And, you have somebody like Bernie Sanders who comes in, and I don't agree with everything he stood for, but I thought he's a really honest person and believed in what he was doing. And you look at the DNC, every time they have a candidate like him come in, he doesn't stand for everything that they stand for. So they would push him out. They would do everything they could to make him not the candidate. And I think we're going to keep having that problem, no matter how much I love somebody. And if they join a major party, if they're not for that, everything that party stands for, that party is going to kick them out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, this is where, for me, I always want to encourage people to channel their nihilism into, or not channel their nihilism, but that frustration is to channel it into the spaces where they might actually be able to have a little more influence. So I think that, focusing more on movement-based politics, focusing more on grassroots politics, focusing more on who in your immediate community is doing work to change things that you really support. It would probably be better to align yourself with that person and to try to help them and collaborate with them. And you might actually have an impact in your own community or in your own state than it is to think that you're going to somehow, that you advocating for or supporting some political elite that is completely out of reach and completely lives in a different context than you and I is going to be open to these things. So I think, I become, the more that I've studied these things, and I think part of this is also, I'm currently doing my next project, which is focusing on grassroots democracy in the United States. And, there's obviously kind of a big link there with drug policy reform and grassroots democracy. I think increasingly I see that as because, I think it's important for people to have hope, and I think it's important for people to have avenues for change. And I think, unfortunately, I think that presidential and electoral politics, it's important to not completely disengage. It's good to know what's going on. It's good to vote. I mean, I'm not one of those don't vote people, but I also think that it's just not the space where change happens. I think change happens from below. And I think change happens in communities before it happens. Basically, you have to create an environment where so much change has taken place in communities that it almost seems politically advantageous at that point for a major politician to take that stance and claim it as their own. By the time that a local grassroots initiative has been co-opted by a political elite, that's not ideal, but it is actually a real marker of success. And that's actually what I think does create some type of accountability, even if it's not, immediate. But I think that's actually how change takes place, is growing movement capacity and growing the democratic capacity and growing the awareness of people on the ground in a community. So, when you're having conversations with people who are involved in the drug culture or people who are drug users themselves, raising their consciousness and their awareness about what's going on in their community, what organizations are doing to support them, what opportunities there are to get involved in activism locally. All of those things can be incredibly empowering. And, I think that's kind of the real space where I'm sensing, at least in the work that I'm doing, where I'm sensing a little bit of a sea change and where I'm sensing that people are actually like doing the work and like doing really cool stuff and having victories. And I think those are good spaces to pay attention to, is what's happening at that level. It might not rise to the level of like major political discourse or like, what gets like the headlines, but it really does make a huge impact. And it is a space where people can really, start to try to change things. So I definitely agree with you that it's like, I think there's such a huge emphasis on the federal level and voting and all that kind of stuff. But I think we're learning through a really tragic experience right now that politicians need to be under a lot more pressure to do the thing that's maybe morally or ethically correct or correct from a human rights standpoint, if it's not considered contagious for them and their donors, or them and the people that they represent. You really have to make it so that they're doing something not only unpopular, but something that seems immoral. And I think that's really, I think how a lot of these changes happen.
I love that. And I haven't actually thought about, I don't know why I've never thought about, trying to get into local politics or, talking or helping with them. I'm in Lee County, Florida. So it's extremely, it's Trump flags everywhere. Let's go Brandon chants at the bar. So I just kind of feel like I'm not going to have anything in common with any of the local political parties or anything, but that's not true. There's people that think like me here. I just got to find them and then, start there.
I think, and I think, that's something that I think that's a big thing that I've really come to try to understand, is like, kind of like what you said. I think, this is something that I think about a lot as a sociologist, as someone who, it's kind of my job, for better or worse, sometimes for worse, sometimes for better, to think about big social problems like the war on drugs. Is like, it can be so overwhelming and so depressing when you think about these big systems, and you think about, it's almost like these big machines that are kind of like chewing people up and spitting people out, and it's so tragic. And it's like, I've been just kind of in this place of trying to figure out, where can we carve out a sense of empowerment and agency? Because I talk to so many people since I put my book out, just conversations I've had with colleagues, friends, family members, doing podcasts, meeting with like policy people, is like, there's way more people that are open and want to like really take this stuff seriously than you might think. They might not be like, I think what's unfortunate maybe for where you're coming from is they might not be the loudest, maybe most visible people. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm probably in a lot more of a progressive bubble, I guess I would say, where I live, even though we definitely have our own issues with police repression, the war on drugs, the criminalization of homelessness. There is still some really, really horrible human rights violations taking place. But at least I know, when I talk to an average person on the street, there's going to be a lot more common ground than not. But I think, this is something that I want to encourage listeners to try out. And it's something that's been helpful for me, is this thing called asset mapping, which I think sounds like a fancy term that's used maybe in like finance or, I don't know, real estate or something. But actually all it really means is like, just go on Google, look up what the organizations are in your area that already exist, that are already doing the things that you support. And you don't have to start from scratch. You don't have to do it on your own. You don't have to feel like you're solely responsible. All you have to do is figure out who's already doing the stuff that you want to do and how you can support them and how you can be a part of it. And it might not even be necessarily a perfect fit off the bat. Not every organization is going to be right for you, but finding basically like finding people that you can collaborate with in these kind of spaces, creating numbers and creating organizations and feeling like you can have more and more conversations with like-minded people. It really brings the humanity and the agency back into it, to where people don't feel like they're just being like crushed under the thumb. And I think that's like such an important space to pay attention to. And it's something that, I'll be honest, it didn't occur to me for a long time either to do, to be honest. You know, I've lived in a lot of different places with a lot of different political cultures.
Well, one thing I have learned though, talking to like, I have my neighbors, they have the Trump flags flying up, but we're still friendly and everything. But I'll talk to them about, like, when we talk about drug policy, that's not an issue that real life Republicans like him, like Republicans in the Congress might only vote, 3 of them might vote for the MORE Act, but your everyday working class Republican, they don't care about weed being legal. They don't care if I'm getting high. And I think that if you said we should end the drug war because it's costing billions of dollars, and because it's making addiction and overdose problems worse, if they actually saw the things, they would all be on my side on this. I'm not looking for more people on drugs and more people to be addicted to drugs. That's not what we want. We want the same things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the major issues. And I think, you know, it's unfortunate because on one side, I think that this is another space where the media does play a really big role in shaping people's political identities. You know, I think that there is a certain extent to which for both liberals and conservatives, that they're watching a lot of mainstream news outlets that are really giving them a certain sense of who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, who they should support, who they should be against. But what there isn't a lot of conversation about, and this is where these kind of conversations can really break down barriers, is when was the last time you saw a conversation on TV where people were literally just talking about a specific public policy and looking at the evidence and research for how that policy is going to impact people? Not, is this going to be advantageous for the Democrats or the Republicans in the upcoming election? Or, you know, what did this politician say that was inflammatory? But just literally like, okay, how is this policy impacting a community, and how should it be? And based off that, what should we do? Like, that part has been completely removed. And so people do politics in a way that's extremely based in good guys, bad guys. You know, their identities are invested in catchphrases and slogans, and their personalities are shaped by their political identities. And I think in some sense that can be a real big, you know, it can help people stay invested and stay involved with the things that they care about. It's not necessarily an all bad thing, but it does make it so that when we try to have these conversations about policy issues, it really does muddy the waters, because a lot of times these are investments that people have made about their fundamental worldview and their beliefs and what the world looks like, and who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, what's the moral code of the world. And like, that's not always open to evidence. That's not always open to moving beyond it. But no, I think that's important. I think you know, what you've just identified is really important, is being willing to have those conversations with anyone who will have them, as long as it's not destructive. You know, you might have conflict that's productive, or you might have conflict that's destructive, and knowing the difference, but also finding out who your actual true allies are, that are just maybe in your community that you've never met. I think those are 2 really great strategies.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to look into that. And I love that advice. I appreciate that. I was thinking that one of the problems we have in this country, though, in the political world, is if you have one candidate who's running and presents data. Let's say somebody presents the data on drugs and says, we need to decriminalize drugs. That's what the data says. Science shows it. Portugal did it. Their crimes went down. And they present it like that. Then the other candidate, all they have to do is run ads saying this candidate supports drugs and wants everybody to be on drugs. And then the their attention span is so short that they see that ad and they immediately think that this candidate wants my kids on drugs, so I'm not voting for him. And it reminds me, Bernie Sanders was asked on a podcast if he supported cannabis legalization. He said he did. And then he was asked, what about decriminalization of all drugs? And he immediately was like, oh, no, we're not ready for that. And I think he would be for it, but he knew if he would have said that, his political career would have been over. You can't say that in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's a problem. We can't have, a lot of politicians at least can't have these honest discussions because they're worried what the other side's, what ads are going to play with what they said, and little clips that ruin their chances of being elected.
Yeah, no, that's really difficult. That's very difficult. And that's why I think the grassroots efforts and grassroots organizations matter. And that's why having grassroots activism that is getting represented in media really matters, to present like a counter narrative to that. Because I think you're right. I think that is all it takes sometimes is advertisements or creating a narrative about someone, or you can kind of scare people. And yeah, that's one of the things that's very dangerous about sort of our current political system is people are very much interested and very constrained by the need to be reelected and the need to be in power. And so from my perspective, I think that's where this all connects is like, the more that there are ground up grassroots efforts to pass local laws, to put pressure on local representatives to sort of turn the tide that way, the more that politicians can take a stance that was once considered fringe and take it confidently and not worry about losing support. I mean, it does say something that the Biden campaign and the Harris campaign and all of these campaigns, they knew that it was an overwhelmingly popular sentiment and that it would help them get elected to say that they wanted to decriminalize cannabis. I mean, that does speak to a pretty radical sea change that I think at a big part is because of the efforts of activists. So like these things happen like probably slower than what we would be cool with. It's much slower than what would be ideal. But, in the long scale of things, like we can actually see things changing, and we can see progress, and we can see the actual conversations, the debate changing. And I think, I think that change kind of trickles up from the bottom more so than from the top. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of, that does speak to something at least.
It does. I mean, the harm reduction movement started as a grassroots movement and it's been taboo. A lot of places, like I've talked to people that said they were, when they're giving speeches, were told not to use the word harm reduction. But now we have Biden used the word harm reduction in his State of the Union address. So that's a step forward. And then he also passed a bill supporting harm reduction. But then you saw what happened with the media. They immediately made it sound like he was supporting people smoking crack or something like that. It was all over Twitter. But either way,
I think that is the issue.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just agreeing with you. I think this is exactly the problem with, and this is something that I talk about in the book actually. So I'm glad we're kind of going in that direction. And this is what I call kind of common sense myths. Like there can be a media campaign that is literally based off of promoting a myth about drug use, and it can be more impactful if it resonates with people's already existing fears than the actual evidence and truth. And that's really concerning. I saw the exact same things that you did, and this is what we call a moral panic, is that when you take a policy or a practice or a trend or an activity and basically overestimate it and depict it as a threat to the safety and security of people in society, basically it creates a fear and panic about it that's not warranted. But then that fear and panic is very useful for maintaining power, for keeping certain policies in place. And I think, that's one of the major issues also with politicians at that level, is they become so concerned with optics and rhetoric and, things like that. Like one thing that I see all the time is people basically saying, self-censoring, basically saying, well, we can't advocate for that because that's like giving a point to our adversaries that, you know, they'll spin it in this direction. So we can't even advocate for this thing. And it's like, I think that's a really bad tendency.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's a shame that sometimes you almost don't disagree. Like, for instance, Bernie Sanders, if he came out and said, no, I think we should legalize all drugs. If I were him, I wouldn't have said that either, even though I definitely think it's just like, if you're running for that big of an office like that, you can't just, there's things you just can't say. And like you said, it's moving in the right direction and it's slow. And I think it's okay. Like you said, I'd much rather just say, let's tomorrow just legalize everything, get everybody, nonviolent offenders out of prisons immediately. All that I would do immediately. But it's not going to happen that way. So we one step at a time. Cannabis legalization is the first step. That's what we're seeing. And I think that in itself is changing people's minds because they've realized they've been lied to. A lot of elderly people down here now have cannabis cards and are using it as medicine. And they realize this is not the stuff that they thought it was, that they were told it was by media and by their government. So I think they're going to start questioning the whole drug world altogether.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, as the myths sort of have less influence on the public, you know, one thing I think is just being vigilant about new myths and new moral panic. So the one that you brought up about fentanyl, I think is a huge area where they're going to try to drum up a lot of fear and panic about that. I mean, you see these news stories about how, you know, police officers are worried about accidentally overdosing off of fentanyl because they like touched it, which is not an actual thing that can happen. It's been debunked. So like, or even in the UK recently, there was a synthetic cannabinoid gummy, like edible product. I think it was maybe something in the THC Delta 9 category where it wasn't just like straightforward cannabis. And it might have even been like a synthetic cannabinoid, like one of those like K2s or like the ones that they used to have back in the day, as a way of sort of getting around the legal loopholes. Someone had a severe health reaction to that. And all of the headlines in the UK presented it as this person overdosed because they took a marijuana edible. That's how they presented it. So
yeah,
I think that it's something like that is the other battleground, is definitely over the information and whether or not it's presented accurately. And
yeah,
like, I think
one of the biggest examples of that was, do you remember the guy that ate the guy? It's a horrible thing that happened in Miami. The guy was eating the guy's face and the cops shot him. And then the headlines immediately blamed it on bath salts, and bath salts at the time were illegal. And it was like a month later, they passed the bill outlawing bath salts. I don't know much about bath salts, never did them, but the thing is that it was determined that there was no bath salts. There was actually no drugs at all in the system other than THC, but not enough to assume that he even did it that day. He was sober. But does anybody remember that? Every time I've talked about that story to somebody, they're like, oh yeah, bath salts. It's like, see, that's all they remember.
Bath salts, and you take bath salts and it makes you cannibal, you know. And that's you know, that is the heart of moral panics. Like, I'll be honest, like that is the one historical constant in the war on drugs. There are always going to be people who are moral entrepreneurs, and what I mean by that is they're going to be interested in attaining power and influence, and, you know, attaining attention, whatever it is they're trying to get out of it. Maybe they even truly believe in what they're doing, but there are always going to be people who are going to be interested in creating a fear narrative around substances in a way that ends up very much distorting things. And that's where I think that the not even just the information, but if people have understanding of some of these basic concepts and frames, you know, the idea that most drug use is not dysfunctional or disordered or driven by addiction, I think is surprising to people. It's a fact that I present to people, and I can tell that they kind of have to process it, because, you know, debunking these basic myths makes it so that these propaganda campaigns are less effective too. So yeah, I think the public education part of it is so big, and you know, that's why I appreciate the work that people like yourself are doing, just to kind of get more information out there to people. who are involved in this kind of space at whatever capacity. Like, I think that's really great.
Yeah, I remember I was at one of my gigs. I play music around town, and I was reading on my break. I was reading Dr. Carl Hart's book, Drug Use for Grownups, and this drunk girl came over to request a song, and she's like, "Oh, what are you reading?" And I showed her the title. She's like, "What else?" She's like, "What kind of drugs?" I was like, "Oh, it's about legalizing heroin." I just to see what reaction I would get, and she like freaked out about it and was like, "Oh, what? Like that's crazy." And she went and I heard her telling her friends like, "This guy's talking about legalizing heroin." She's like. And it was just crazy. It's like she was really like drunk. And it's just like, people don't understand that you're on a very, very powerful, hard drug right now. Just because it's legal doesn't mean it's not just as dangerous and actually more dangerous.
More dangerous. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we talk about cannabis exceptionalism in the drug reform community, but yeah, the way that people carve out a completely separate category for alcohol is a little wild as well. Like, I think that's one of the things that the ultimate irony is someone being completely blackout drunk and pretending to have an anti-drug stance is a little bit ironic.
I went into a bar the other day, and there was this is a no drug zone. Anybody caught doing drugs here will be prosecuted. And I just want to be like, you're a bar. You make all your money selling drugs.
I mean, they sell drugs at a coffee shop. If we really want to be technical about it, they sell drugs at your local coffee shop.
Exactly.
And just because those are the drugs that are approved, those are the drugs that don't really alter your consciousness in a way that's going to make you more introspective. If anything, they'll make it so you can blow off some steam, or in the case of caffeine, it'll make it so you're a more productive worker. So those ones get the thumbs up. And I think that's the thing that's so fascinating about it is like, there is definitely these double standards that are so glaring. I mean, and the double standard that you pointed out between alcohol and cannabis or alcohol and other substances, that I think is such an eye-opening moment for a lot of people. Once you put that together, it's kind of like you can't really put the cat back in the bag once you realize how fundamentally dysfunctional that is. Not only just in terms of like how much rampant alcohol related violence, car accidents, all kinds of stuff is like kind of actively encouraged and celebrated in America, but how much alternative ways of altering your consciousness are demonized as only being addictive and harmful and dangerous. Like it is kind of the crux of it, I think, for sure.
Yeah, it is. And it is crazy. I work on the beach and playing music for the drunkest people, tourists down here. And, I remember when cannabis was up for the vote, I said something about voting for it. And like some people got mad, and one person's like, "Oh, he's talking about marijuana." It's like you guys are all getting to enjoy what you like to do, get drunk. And you see I've seen so many violent things happen on alcohol. And again, we've all agreed at society that we don't want alcohol to not be allowed, but we want it to be done responsibly. But it's such a hypocritical point to think that your alcohol consumption is somehow better than somebody else who chooses to do a different drug. And cannabis is the easy one because it's the most harmless of the other substances. Heroin, I'm for legal heroin for addicts, but I have quite a lot of questions about it myself because I don't think it's something everybody should do. And it definitely is addictive. I've had addiction to Vicodin, so I've went through the withdrawals and I know what that feels like. It wasn't easy getting off of it, but again, these are people's choices. Anyway, I think we did. Yeah. We covered a lot of ground. I got to get off here because I got to get ready to go to work.
No worries. Yeah, I think that's the problem. We could probably talk forever about this stuff.
For sure. We'll do it again. Nerd. After I read the book, I'll have you back on, man. I love talking with you, and I really appreciate you doing this. And your book is Debating the Drug War, and I bought mine on Amazon because I didn't have my credit card with me when I was looking at your site, and I was like, I'm just lazy, so I just went on Amazon and recorded. But do you recommend getting it from your website? Is that better for you?
I would say the best way to get it is either bookshop.org is a really great resource because they source their books through like local bookshops, local independent booksellers.
Okay.
Or you can get it through Routledge.com. my personal website is michaelrosino.com. You can see me on Twitter. I post a lot of stuff about race and politics and drug policy. And that's just my name, at Michael Rosino. So, yeah, no. And if anyone wants to reach out to me on Twitter, anything like that, if anyone's interested in collaborating or anything, I'm always up for that. So, yeah, I know. And Aaron, thanks again for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you. We'll definitely do it again. It was great talking to you.
Sounds good. All right. You too.
All right. Bye.
Take care.
All right, peace, Nicks. Thanks for listening. Again, the website that he recommended buying his book at is bookshop.org. It's also available on Amazon. It's Debating the Drug War by Michael Rosino. Follow him on Twitter at Michael Rosino. And if you like what we're doing here, go on Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star rating. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram, The Peace on Drugs podcast. And if you want to subscribe to our newsletter, go to www.thepeaceondrugs.com/subscribe. And don't forget, if you want to try a hemp cigarette that doesn't taste like shit, it's a great substitute for tobacco. And go to sugarcali.com, enter the offer code PEACE15 for 15% off. And if you like Kratom, if you enjoy Kratom, I like Kratom and I enjoy Kratom, and I really like this company, Happy Hippo Herbals. If you don't know what Kratom is, I might not be talking about this for you. You can look into it. It is an opiate. It is. There are so many things I'm not supposed to say and can't say because it's not FDA approved that I'd like to just tell my listeners to do their research. I do enjoy Kratom. It is an opiate. It is a non-morphine derivative opiate. It reacts on our opioid receptors, but is only a partial agonist. So it is, in my opinion, much safer than, for instance, the street drugs that could be the alternative for opiates. But if you want to try some Kratom, go to happyhippoherbals.com, enter the offer code THEPEACE15 for 15% off. Thank you so much for listening. Let's hand it over to Twiggy Branches. Peace out.
You pay for what you can't. You pay for what you can't. When you align yourself with the 4 p.m. jet set. Bet head, bet high, moves hard, pocket in mind. Go on, sending love east through cocaine and smog. Watching the sunrise, watching it all, Sunset Boulevard. Are you my doctor? Are you my dealer? Are you my You pay for what you get. You pay for what you get. You pay for what you get. When you align yourself with the 4 p.m. jet set. Bet head, bet high, moves hard, pocket in mind. So there, sending in a breeze, and by the grace of God, I'll see the sunrise. I'll see the sunrise. Are you my doctor?